Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Generac GP 5500. This is one of two machines dropped off by a local subscriber. He picked these up, $50 a piece. Doesn't really know anything about them, but the person selling them said they both ran well the last time they ran. Of course, from looking at it, I would say that was some time ago. This machine has clearly spent most of its life outdoors. We're missing the wheel kit. The tank was rotted and thrown away. We have no carburetor and airbox. So this, I would say, likely is a parts machine, but we don't know that for sure. So today, the goal is going to be to get this machine running and making power again. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So first things first, let's check the oil. Make sure it has some. And yeah, it does have oil. It's pretty dark and does not smell like fuel, so I would say we're off to a good start. That said though, I'm going to pull the drain bolt. I just want to make sure there isn't any water in the crankcase before trying to turn this engine over. So it needs an oil change, but we're going to let this machine earn it. But being that this machine, I would say, has been outdoors for quite a while, there's a chance there is some water down here. And no, all oil. So that is a good sign. Let's make sure the engine's not locked up. And it does rotate, although it feels a little bit tight. And there is a little bit of compression, but it definitely feels like there is a lot of leak down. So let's actually get the plug out. I want to get some oil in the cylinder. We'll check the compression, check for spark, and go from there. Wow, that plug is in there. Yeah, that does not feel good. It is turning. But it's very tight. So I don't know if it's pulling the threads out or if there's rust on it. But neither one is good. Wow, that is tight. All right, it's coming out a lot better. So maybe we don't have rust on the plug. So yeah, there is some rust on the plug. So that is definitely not a good sign. I've seen worse, but you don't want to see any rust on a spark plug because usually that means there is moisture down on the cylinder. And yeah, potentially we have bigger issues. So actually, before I get any oil in there, let's take a peek with the Boroscope and just see what we're dealing with. All right, let's take a look. And can't see a whole lot. The piston's near the top, so I'm going to rotate the engine. Try to get that piston to the bottom, which is right about there. And yeah, actually, from what I can see on the cylinder walls, they actually look pretty good. I see a bit of crosshatch. more importantly, I don't see a whole lot in the way of rust. So let's switch cameras to the side one. That'll give us a little bit better look at the condition of the cylinder. All right, now we get the side camera on. So this is the top of the cylinder. You can see there is definitely a little bit of rust, but it's very light rust and plenty of crosshatch. So I did just get a glimpse of one of the valves. Let's see if we can take a look at that again. Yeah, a little bit of rust, a little bit of carbon flaking off. But overall, not too bad. You know, I think this engine is definitely gonna run. So let's get some oil down there. Check for spark and compression. A little bit of Marvel Mystery Oil. And some penetrating oil. Let's turn the engine over, spread that oil around, and the engine already feels a lot better. Yeah, feels a lot better. All right, let's check for sparks. So we've got a tester right here that should light up, and we should also see it at the tip of the plug. So I'm going to kill the lights. Turn the ignition on, and let's pull the engine over. Okay. We got strong spark, both at the plug and the tester. So let's turn the switch off, make sure that that can kill the spark. And it does. So I think we're good as far as spark goes. All right, so we get the spark tester out of the way, and we'll check for compression next. Now, this is not going to be the best test because we did put oil in the cylinder, so that's going to skew the results. Plus, this engine has a decompression system, so, you know, at best, you know, we're only going to see about 60 psi. All right, so keep an eye on the tester. We want to see at least 50, you know, ideally 60 psi. And it's not looking good. We have about 30, and that is not enough. So, you know, I'm hoping that comes up once the engine runs. You know, I'm thinking there is just a little bit of rust on those valves. So let's actually put a little fuel down there. We'll put a new spark plug in and just pull it over and see if this thing shows any signs of life. So we'll give it just a bit of fuel. And we'll install a brand new NGK BPR 6ES. All right, let's give this a try. The ignition's on. We have fuel in the cylinder. So I'm hoping this shows some signs of life. Nice. I'm kind of surprised it just started as easily as it did. And the good news is the compression feels a lot better. Very little leak down now. So likely there was just a little bit of surface rust on those valves. And now that the engine has rotated a bit, you know, those valves are starting to clean up. So I'm going to get the compression tester back in there. We'll do another test and see where it comes in at. All right, get the tester back in. Let's give it a few pulls. And surprisingly, not a lot different. So, yeah, I'm not sure what to think about that one. Potentially the valves are out of adjustment, or maybe we just need to run it a little bit longer to help those valves clean up. So let's actually get a carburetor on here. I do want to run it longer. We can hook up a light, see if it's making power, and we'll check back on the compression. So I think we'll give this carburetor a try. It's obviously not new. It is a used one, but I just double checked. The main jet's clear. Needle seems to be working, and the bowl is fairly clean. So we'll get the bowl back on, throw a new gasket in place, bolt it down, feed it some fuel, and we'll try to start this again. All right, so we'll get a new gasket fitted. And I might clean up the blower housing while we have good access to it. You know, surprisingly, it's not terrible. I mean, there is some rust, but really not too bad considering how long it was outside. Okay, needle and seat shut off. We're full of fuel right to that level. So I'm going to get a light plugged in. We'll try starting it again. And this time, hopefully it can run a little longer, you know, at least long enough to validate if the generator is making power. All right, let's give this another go. We've got a light plugged in and turned on. Kilowatts also plugged in. And we have an unknown carburetor fueled up and ready to go. So I did not check the pilot jet, so hopefully that is not clogged. Guess we'll find out. Yeah, I'm thinking that pilot might be clogged. Let's give it a little help. Oop. And we're actually flooding over. So yeah, unknown carburetor. Not in great shape. So let's try one more pull. All right, so the good news is we are making power and the engine sounds healthy, but the carburetor is not running it well. So I'm going to take a second, just swap out this for a brand new one, and we'll try restarting it, and hopefully it runs a little better this time. All right, so we get the carb secured. This carb, besides being new, is a little different in that it has a fuel solenoid. Now, this does not need to be powered, and actually this machine cannot power it. So it's a little bit different. Because a fuel solenoid on a tractor, you would need power to open it to allow fuel to flow through the main jet. But on a generator, the normal position is open, and if you don't power it, then you're not going to have an issue. Really, the only time this comes into play is when you turn the ignition to off. This energizes until the generator runs out of power. But in this case, we're just going to tuck these wires off to the side, and they will not be plugged in to anything. All right, let's try this again. We are refueled, brand new carb. Ignition's on, choke's on. Interesting. So I find it very interesting that a brand new carburetor is running the engine exactly the same way. Really, the only improvement here is that we're not leaking any fuel, but the engine, no change in how it's running. So, potentially it's just jetted very lean, but I find that hard to believe because the choke was fully on and the engine was still starving for fuel. So potentially we have a vacuum leak. And the only thing between the carb and the engine is the plastic insulator. So either the gasket on the backside is damaged, or maybe the insulator itself is damaged or warped. So I'm going to get the carburetor back off. We'll get the insulator off. We'll inspect it closely. And regardless, I think I am going to try a new one, or at least a different one, and see if it runs any better. Actually, this insulator looks to be in great shape. Gasket also looks to be good. I don't see any cracking. Doesn't appear to be warped. But I think the issue is actually the gasket I used. This channel right here, there is a port on the carburetor. So if the needle and seat don't work and the carb floods over, the fuel comes out here and is taken away and floods out underneath the carb. But when I hold the gasket onto it that I was using, you can see that channel is exposed. And that right there is the vacuum leak. So let me find a better fitting gasket, and I think this machine is going to run quite a bit better. Yeah, so this is the gasket here I should have used. You can see it's different. It has that little hole right there, so that if it floods over, the fuel exits that way and is carried down below. And you can see now we don't have that channel exposed. It's a much better fit. So, I'm guessing the gasket that was on there may have been for the engine side, although it looks different from the one that's on there now. But yeah, that should have been between the engine and the insulator. And this one should be between the insulator and the carburetor. All right, let's try this one more time. Choke's on, ignition's on. So this time, still not perfect, but much, much better. You know, before I couldn't get rid of the surge, even with the choke fully applied. And this time I did have to partially apply the choke to get things to run smooth. And after about 30 or 40 seconds, I tried turning it all the way off. And I thought we had it there for a second, but the surge did come back. So now we are only dealing with a jetting issue on the pilot circuit. So I'm going to pull that pilot jet out. We're going to drill it out maybe 1 or 2 sizes, and likely that will solve this issue. So we'll get the idle set screw out. And then there's a spacer here on top of the pilot jet. And then we can pry the pilot out of place. This does have an adjustable needle as well on the pilot circuit, but it only adjusts kind of one of the jets. And the pilot circuit is actually made up of about 4 or 5. And usually that's not enough to correct this issue. So what you want to do is just use a micro drill bit set and figure out where the first one is that doesn't fit. So that one is a snug fit. And the one right after that does not fit. So we're going to pull that one out and drill it to that size. Okay, and we're through. Usually you do need to go up more than one size, but yeah, it's a lot harder to put material back. So if you overshoot, then, well, you got a problem. So we'll start with one size up. See where that gets us. So we'll put the spacer back, and then the idle set screw, which this machine doesn't idle, but you do need it to hold the pilot in place. So just screw it in enough so that 1 or 2 threads poke out the other side, like that. And that should do it. So I'm going to refuel. We'll try to start it again, and hopefully this time we can actually turn the choke all the way off. All right, so let's try this again with the drilled out pilot jet. So yeah, this carb, I'm not quite sure I want to stick with it. This brand I tried a few years ago and never got it to run right. And this one, you know, we drilled out the pilot jet. It's now running pretty well without a load. You know, still a touch lean, but then I put on a light 1500 watt load and it started to surge again. So the main jet also has issues. The pilot jet still isn't quite right. And this particular brand, I did try one a few years back. I've actually tried this carb on several machines and never got it to run right. And then recently I accidentally ordered the same exact carb. So I was hoping the newer version would be a little bit better, but it shouldn't be this much effort to swap in a brand new carburetor. So I'm I'm actually more inclined to put the original carb on there that we tried. Now that the vacuum leak is solved, I'm willing to bet that carb is going to run a lot better than this one. And the issue with the fuel leak on this carb that we tried originally was that the O-ring right here is actually split. So it was not forming a good seal, and that's why it was leaking fuel. So I'm going to get a good O-ring on there, and we'll get this carb reinstalled. So I'm going to pause it. You've already seen me pull the carb on and off this machine a bunch of times. So I'm going to do it again. Just this time, no vacuum leak and a good O-ring, so hopefully no fuel leak either. All right, we'll try this again. We're back to the first carb we tried, except this time no vacuum leak, and we're also not leaking fuel. So we'll get it started, assuming it runs well without a load. We'll put a light load on it and just make sure it continues to run well. Well, I think we have a winner. This carb definitely running the engine better. It started first pull, and after about 10 seconds, I could turn that choke off fully. The engine ran nice and smooth. I then applied a 1500 watt load, and things continued to run well. So yeah, I'm not sure what's wrong with the new carburetors, but this used one seems to be getting the job done. So it's definitely earned its oil change. And since we have some heat in that oil, let's pull the plug, get the old oil out, and get some fresh oil in its place. So the oil that came out looks pretty good. I mean, it is well-used oil, but there is no contamination, no water, no metal in the oil, so the engine would appear to be in good health. So given that the compression numbers are off, I think we should check the valves. A tight exhaust valve would cause a similar issue. All right, we're loose. And hopefully we can save this gasket, because I'm pretty sure I don't have another. All right, and we saved it. So I'm going to pull the spark plug. We'll get the engine to top dead center and check the clearance. The top end also looks pretty good. Not much in the way of varnish. So it's hard to tell how many hours are on this machine, but given what I'm seeing here, I'm thinking not a whole lot. So I'll rotate the engine. Intake's open, so the piston's going down. Now it's closed. Piston's coming up on the compression stroke. And right there, we should be just past top dead center. And actually, the valves feel pretty good. But let's measure it and make sure. All right, so let's check the exhaust valve. It should be at 6/1000ths of an inch. And it actually fits in there with pretty much no drag. So I was kind of hoping the exhaust would be tight, but it actually appears to be loose because the 7 also fits in there without any drag. Let's try a 10. Yeah, and a 10 fits in there too. A little bit of drag, so I'm guessing it's maybe an 11 or 12, which is about twice what it should be. So I am going to tighten that up. But that's definitely not going to help the low compression test. 12/1000ths also fit. So that exhaust valve gap is pretty big. And a 14 fits with a good amount of drag. So yeah, exhaust for sure has to be adjusted. Let's check the intake as well. That should be 4/1000ths plus or minus 1/1000th. So we'll start with the 4/1000ths feeler gauge. That fits. How about a 5? And a 5 has a fair amount of drag, so I don't think we need to adjust the intake. Yeah, and a 6 won't fit. So the intake's fine. The exhaust, we actually need to tighten that up. Always double check it after you tighten that nut. A 6 is pretty tight. I would say too tight. A 7 does not fit. So I'm going to open that up just a touch. And we'll check it again. 6/1000ths. Yeah, that feels good. And a 7 fits as well, which is fine. That's still on spec. Let's check an 8. And an 8 doesn't fit. So the exhaust valve, the gap's been closed up. And that's not going to help us. But let's throw the compression tester back on there and just make sure we didn't make anything worse. All right, so we'll give this another try, but based on what we found and the adjustment I made, if anything, it's going to make the compression number a little lower. if that's possible. And yeah, geez, definitely lower. What is that, like 27? 25? So not a whole lot of compression. So, I mean, obviously the engine has more compression than that, or it wouldn't run at all. So, I think this might just be a case of a decompression system that's maybe machined a little bit wrong. It's letting out a little bit too much compression. So if we have trouble starting it after the adjustment we made, we might have to open up that clearance again on the exhaust to get a little bit of compression back. So I'm going to get the plug back in and just restart the engine real quick. I want to make sure that, this adjustment we made didn't have a negative effect on this machine's ability to start. So good. Even with that adjustment, the engine can still start. I think the big question is it down on power? And with a decompression system, it's really hard to tell if we have some issues with the compression. So really the only way we're going to know for sure is to load test this and just make sure it can pull its rated load of 5,500 watts. Of course, we're still missing a lot of things, namely a wheel kit, the tank, and airbox, and I'm sure some other stuff we'll discover along the way. So, I would like to make this complete, or at least try to improve it as much as I can. So I've been scrounging around, and I have come up with most of the parts we need to make this machine mobile again. We have a set of wheels, a handle, we do need a couple feet, and of course, the main thing is the tank. So I believe I have one out in the storage locker, and likely some other stuff we can use as well. So let's make a trip out there. We'll gather what we can, get this thing together, and then finally we can get it outside and see how it does under load. All right, so there's definitely a few things in here we can use to improve on that generator. The blower housing isn't terrible that's on it, but there is some rust. Pull cord needs to be replaced. So I'm thinking we should probably bring back a few Generac blower housings. These are in perfect condition. I think the only catch is that, we have a Hemi head, and the blower housings actually differ a little bit. I believe that one is for a Hemi, but we'll bring back a couple just in case. Got no shortage of blower housings. We also have a tank. Now, this tank should fit. Yeah, it's right up there. I guess the only catch is I don't know if it's for a GP 5500 or a 7500, because although the opening's the same, the 7500 is a higher capacity tank and it might actually hit the top of the engine. But we can shim that and make it work. The other thing we need is a foot for when we add a wheel kit, and I thought I had one here, but I guess I already stole it for something else. So yeah, that could be a problem, but maybe I can come up with something. All right, so we're back with the rest of the parts, and I was able to scrounge up 1 foot. We actually need 2. You can see right there what it's supposed to look like, 1 on each side. So I do have another frame, actually it's from a GP 7500, that I use to test engines, and that frame I believe has 2 of these feet on it, so we'll probably steal the other foot from that frame. So let's start there actually. Let's get the machine mobile. Then we'll proceed to clean it up, get the tank on, and we should be good to go. So we'll clean the frame up a bit. I said, surprisingly, it's not terribly rusty. It's really just sun faded. You know, there are some areas of rust, but considering how long I think this was outside, it actually fared pretty well. Yeah, we're gonna have to pull the carb too. And this is the main difference on a blower housing for a Hemi head. It has this cutout right here, which is pretty different from the non-Hemi, which is right over here. So if I rotate this and we look at the same part, you can see that's almost smooth compared to that right there. So this blower housing we cannot use, but this one does have the right cutout. So we'll use this one instead. So we'll get this back on, hopefully for the last time. On the non-Hemi engines, you don't actually need to pull the carburetor, but the Hemi engine, because of the way that this kind of wraps around the insulator, and it's pretty tight fit down here with this bracket, there's really no good way to get it off unless you remove both the carburetor and the insulator. Then the blower housing comes right out. So we're going to use this airbox. You know, this was from a machine that, well, wasn't so lucky. And this box, it's mostly complete. It is not quite right in a couple ways. I guess first off, we have a connection here for a tank vent, which we don't have, so we need to plug that off. Otherwise, that's going to be potentially unfiltered air going into the engine. And the only other issue with this box is that there is supposed to be a metal plate right here, which I actually do have one extra. But given the other machine, which we haven't started working on, is also missing an airbox, I'll probably just use that other airbox with that metal piece for that machine. But that is a common part to go missing on these airboxes. I'm not sure kind of how critical it is, but I've never seen a problem caused by not having that metal plate right there. So even though that other carb didn't run this engine well, it is part of a kit that came with this gasket and an air filter. So those items I think we can at least use for this. And actually, let's get a real fuel line on, because once the airbox is in place, it's a lot harder to do this. And that same carb kit also came with a fuel line, so we'll use that as well. Hopefully we'll have better luck with that than the actual carburetor. And we're just going to use like an automotive style vacuum cap to seal that up. It's starting to look pretty respectable. So we're just about done with this side. Really the biggest outstanding thing is just the ignition switch. This one had a plug instead of a switch. So, you know, I was trying to get this old switch out, but it's not going to come out, at least not in one piece. You know, the way these are designed, it's really meant to just go in and not come out. So instead, we'll just get a new switch installed on this cover. Yeah, should I be concerned? Brand new switch. Notice this wire rotated pretty easily, and then I just gave it a little tug. And yeah, it looks like it was never connected from the factory. So this switch is out. And I'm not sure I have any other new switches, but let me take a look. All right, so I do have one more. Not quite the same part, although it says it's compatible with the GX390, which this is a clone of. But there's a few differences which I'm not a big fan of. I guess first off, this one picks up the ground from this metal tab right here. And the switch we were going to install on the switch on the other blower housing actually has a dedicated wire going over to a source of ground. And like this, I'm not sure we're going to get a ground given that this is painted. So we might have to maybe take a little paint off of there. And then the other issue, well, is that we have one lead here going to the ignition coil. So like this, the switch will shut the engine down, but the oil module cannot. So we actually need to splice all three of these together in order for this to work. So yeah, let's just start with getting the switch installed. We'll test it, make sure that, it's able to send to ground. And if we get through that issue, then we'll make some sort of connector to join this into the existing harness. And we'll just test it with the multimeter set to test for continuity. So right now it's off. So that should be passing a ground from the block to this wire. And unfortunately, it's not. So, yeah, I was a little worried about that for a couple of reasons. One, this cover is painted up real well, and, the ground has to go from the cover to the block. So, are we not making a connection here, or are we not making one between the cover and the block? Or is the switch just bad? Not sure. Let's see if we can get that out. Okay, came out in one piece. Let's just test it and make sure the switch isn't bad. So it's in the off position. We should get a tone. And we don't. Let's just double check. No. So another new switch. That's bad. So let me keep digging. Might have one more. Yeah, I've got one more. So we'll set this switch aside and we'll test this one before we install it. So it's in the off position. So same test, we'll just touch one lead there, the other lead to the contact. Okay, and that one seems to work. So I'm going to sand that a little more, then we'll install it, test it out. All right, it's in. Let's see if it works. So it's in the off position, so like that. We should get a beep if we touch one lead to this wire and another lead to a source of engine ground. And we do. And in the on position, we should get nothing. And we don't. But when we turn it back off, we get a ground. So the switch is good. Let's get it connected to the harness. So to fix this, I'm just going to sacrifice this other switch right here. This one's already broken. It's missing the backing plate, and it's no good without that. So what we can do is cut off this wire, and we will use it to connect to the ignition coil. The other lead will connect to the low oil module. And then, we'll cut the wire right here. We could put another bullet connector to also make this a quick release, but the bullet connectors I have aren't great, not as good as what's on there right now. So I'm just gonna connect these two wires permanently. That's actually how it would have been, if we'd used a switch like this. So I don't think we're gonna lose anything by doing that. I'm actually going to strip a little bit more back. I think we're going to have to double up this wire so that the butt connector has enough wire to hold on to. And we'll do the same on the other side. All right, so let's steal the other foot. Now, this is not my parts machine. This is actually the other machine that the subscriber dropped off. And the reason for that is because the other machine, the foot actually looks a little bit different. So we'd actually have to steal both those feet. So for now, we're just going to do the easy thing. And this will be a next week problem because likely we're going to work on this next week, and for all we know, this machine isn't viable. But if it is, then we'll come up with a solution for this. I think this tank's going to work perfect. If this was a GP 7500 tank, the bottom of the tank would actually be hitting the governor adjustment, and instead we have about a 1/2 inch clearance. So this tank, I would say, was likely from a GP 5500, and I was also wrong. There is a tank vent, so we can pull the cap and connect the vent to the airbox. And this tank, I wouldn't say it's in the best shape. You know, the cap looks pretty bad. You know, the top here looks pretty bad. But when you actually get the pre-filter out and take a look further down, you know, there is some light surface rust, but it's really not that bad. So this tank, you know, should last a good long time with a bit of care. But of course, you know, he is going to have to run a fuel filter, which there is one at the fuel valve. So any bits of rust that break off should stay in the tank. And I'm also going to add an inline filter as well. So, you know, although this isn't perfect, you know, I'm going to give him this tank just because of the general condition of it. And it should last him a long time, I would think. You know, of course, he could buy a new one, but that is not very practical. The last time I looked, these tanks were quite expensive. I want to say around $300 or maybe $400. So yeah, definitely a bit too much, I think, for a machine like this. I thought we were done, but I noticed this boot is completely torn up. So I'm going to get that replaced. There's no easy way to do it. You do need to disconnect the wires, you know, feed a new boot in there. But we've come this far, we might as well make it 100%. And in case you're wondering, this is just WD-40. It's a good cleaner, gives it a nice shine. Not a permanent shine, but it does help protect the metal as well. So it's, I would say, going to do nothing but help. It's probably a good thing we did open up the end cover. There's a lot of dust and junk in here. So get that cleaned up a bit, but really what we're after here is, well, a new boot. So we need to cut the zip tie, disconnect pretty much all these wires over here, and then we can slide this out and get a new one in its place. And we should definitely clean up the terminals. They do have some rust and corrosion. Although the backside's not too bad, and that's what makes the connection over to the stator, but still, you know, we get those cleaned up before we get this back together. And these are fairly universal. I think this particular one was from a home light. But any generator that's a Honda clone, kind of in the 5,000 to, I would say, 8 or 9,000 watt range, they're going to have the same boot, more likely than not. So we'll get all this stuff reconnected. Gonna leave these screws kind of loose until we get all the wires situated in the right spot, and then we'll snug them up. And just be careful too, or at least aware of the shrink tubing. On these, they're coming down pretty far, but I think we're okay. Just when you go to tighten it up, make sure you kind of pull it away to keep the shrink tubing out of the connection. Otherwise that's going to act as an insulator. And you might have power problems because of that. All right, so let's give this thing a try. Now, this is going to be an interesting test because the decompression system, as we saw, it is overly aggressive. And like that, it's going to be hard starting. That combined with a very cold engine, like it is right now, I think it's going to take a good few pulls to start. But my hope is once it's running, we'll see that the engine does have proper compression and that we will be able to get up to the rated load of 5,500 watts. So I'm going to get the engine started. While it's warming up, we'll double check the output using the kilowatt to measure the frequency in the hertz. We'll use the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion in the oscilloscope to see what the sine wave looks like. We'll then put on approximately a half load with the load bank. We'll double check the outputs, and if everything looks good, we'll bring it up to the max of 5,500 watts. Yeah, and as suspected, it took a good few pulls to get the engine to start. But once it caught, the engine got up to speed, bypassing the decompression system, and things seem to be running pretty well. Now, the engine speed, it is a little slow, so I'm going to bring that up a little bit, closer to 61.5 Hertz, and then we'll proceed with the testing. And with that adjustment, we're now at about 61.5 Hertz. There is a very slight surge without a load, which I'm hoping will go away once we apply a bit of a load. Anyway, without a load, we're starting at about 4.4% THD, and the sine wave looks pretty typical. So let's put on a load. We'll start with 2,500 watts. So here's 2,000, no issues at all. 2,500, so we're holding above 60 Hertz. THD jumped a bit to 16.3, and the sine wave, a little deformed, but it's smoothed out. And the engine is no longer surging. So let's give it a few minutes. If everything goes well, we'll try the max of 5,500 watts. Alright, it's been a few minutes at 2,500 watts and things are running fine. The engine, I wouldn't say it's surging, but it is floating a bit. It's not 100% steady. Otherwise we're doing pretty well. So let's bring the load up from 2,500 watts to 3,000, 3,500, 4,000, no issues. Engine speed's holding fine. So let's swap this for a 2. So now we're back to 4,000. 5,000, 5,500. So now we're at the rated load. It's holding just fine, maybe a little bit below 59 Hertz. And THD came up to 18.6%. And the sine wave looks more or less unchanged. So let's give this a few minutes to see how it does. Alright, no issues at all pulling its rated load, so we're not really down on horsepower. To produce 5,500 watts, you need about 10 horsepower. This engine's actually rated at 13, so technically we could go over, and at least the engine can handle it. The generator likely isn't going to like it, but we can try it for a short time. I'm just curious to see how much horsepower this engine has. Of course, we could blow a circuit breaker as well. So let's try 6,000 watts. No issues. So we'll swap this. Now we're back to 6. How about 6,500? 7,000. And yeah, we're starting to lose speed, but it's actually doing quite well. Let's try for more. So we're back to 7,000. About 7,500. Nope. Out of horsepower. Which is fine. It's only a 13 horse engine and it's producing 13 horsepower. So let's give things a minute to cool down, then we'll shut it down. Yeah, I think we're cool enough. Being that it's below freezing out. Load bank cooled off pretty fast. So I'm going to shut the light off. We'll turn the fuel valve off, just run it out of gas, and I think we'll be good to go. So yeah, no big surprises here. I thought it was going to be hard to start, and it was. I pulled it, I would say, a good 5 or 6 times before the engine finally started to come to life, which is no surprise. That compression is pretty low. The decompression system, it is letting out too much compression. But once started, it got up to speed, had no issues at all getting to the rated load of the generator of 5,500 watts. And then we pushed it to 7,000 watts, which is the rated load of the engine. And it had no problem doing either. So the engine, it's not down on power. The issue is the compression release. It's just machined a little bit wrong. So the way to fix this properly, obviously, would be to put a new camshaft inside the engine. But given that it does start and runs quite well, I'm not sure it's worth that investment of money or time. Really, I would say the best course of action here is to actually bring that exhaust clearance back up like how it was when we got the machine. It would definitely be over spec, but it does bring the compression up a little bit, and that's what we need. So likely I will make that adjustment before returning it to the owner. But for today, I think we're done. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching. All right, a little bit of bonus footage here. We're going to bump that exhaust valve clearance up. But we don't want to do it too much, because then you do risk the exhaust push rod falling out of place. Yeah, we're at 12, if not a touch over, so I'm going to call that good. And this generator is done, so yeah, tune in next week when we try to fix the other, which I think is a better starting point than the one we just fixed here. So maybe a short video, but you never know.